The avoidant person in your life did not choose distance because they lacked feeling. They chose distance because feeling, for them, once meant danger. Somewhere in their history, closeness was followed by loss, control, or abandonment, and the nervous system made a silent vow. It said, "Never again will I hand my safety to another person." This is the part almost no one understands about avoidant attachment. It is not coldness. It is armor built by a child who had no other way to survive. But here is the truth that will unsettle you. There is one kind of person an avoidant will bond to permanently, without escape, without the usual retreat. It is not the person who chases hardest. It is not the person who gives the most. It is someone who does something far more dangerous to the avoidance defenses, something most people never learn how to do, and by the end of this, you will understand exactly what that is and why it changes everything. Human beings are wired to seek safety before they seek love, and this single fact explains almost everything about the avoidant mind. Long before an avoidant person learns the word attachment, their body has already learned a lesson far more primitive. It has learned that closeness can be unpredictable, that affection can vanish without warning, and that the safest position in any relationship is the one nearest the exit. This is not a flaw of character. It is an adaptation, forged in moments too small for memory, but too large for the nervous system to forget. A father who withdrew love when disappointed, a mother who needed the child to regulate her own emotions instead of the reverse, a household where independence was rewarded and vulnerability was quietly punished. The child in that environment does not decide to become avoidant. The child becomes avoidant the way a hand becomes calloused, through repeated contact with something that hurts. Contrast this with the empath, and a strange symmetry begins to appear. The empath, too, was shaped by an environment that demanded something unnatural of them. Where the avoidant learned to disappear emotionally in order to stay safe, the empath learned to expand emotionally in order to stay valuable. Many empaths grew up as the emotional regulators of their own families, absorbing tension before it could explode, sensing shifts in mood the way a sailor senses a coming storm. Their hyper-attunement was not a gift freely given. It was a survival skill purchased at the cost of their own boundaries. So when an avoidant and an empath meet, what looks like opposite personalities colliding is, underneath, two survival strategies recognizing each other. The avoidant sees someone who will not demand too much too soon. The empath sees someone who finally needs decoding, someone whose depths feel worth the effort. Neither person consciously understands that they have just met their own unfinished business, wearing a different face. Here is the first insight that rarely appears in relationship content, and it will likely surprise you. Avoidants do not run from love. They run from the loss of control that intense love demands. Love, by its nature, asks a person to hand over some portion of their emotional safety to another human being who has the power to damage it. For a securely attached person, this exchange feels natural, even exciting. For an avoidant, this exchange feels like standing at the edge of a cliff with someone else holding the rope. The avoidant does not distrust the specific partner in front of them nearly as often as people assume. The avoidant distrusts the entire mechanism of dependency itself. This is why avoidant behavior can look inconsistent from the outside. One month they seem completely present, warm, engaged. The next month they seem to vanish emotionally, even physically retreat, without any clear external trigger. What changed was not the partner. What changed was the internal alarm that goes off whenever intimacy crosses a threshold the avoidant unconsciously associates with danger. Now consider a harder truth, one that many people resist because it removes the comfort of blame. The partner of an avoidant person often mistakes withdrawal for rejection of them personally, when in reality withdrawal is frequently a rejection of vulnerability itself. This distinction matters more than it appears to. When a person believes they are being rejected, they respond by trying harder, proving their worth, escalating affection in the hope of reversing the retreat. But when withdrawal is actually about the avoidant person's relationship with vulnerability, no amount of proving will fix it, because the problem was never a deficiency in the partner. It was a wound in the avoidant long before that partner ever arrived. This single misunderstanding has ended more relationships than infidelity, more relationships than distance, more relationships than any external circumstance, because it sends both people chasing the wrong solution to the wrong problem. There is a particular kind of person, however, who breaks this cycle entirely, and understanding why requires looking past behavior into something deeper, which is identity. Most people who enter a relationship with an avoidant unconsciously attach their own sense of worth to the avoidant's warmth. When the avoidant pulls away, the partner's self-esteem pulls away with it. This creates a dynamic where the avoidant senses, correctly or not, that their emotional state is now responsible for regulating another person's sense of value. That responsibility feels unbearable to someone who has spent a lifetime avoiding exactly that kind of responsibility for anyone, including themselves. But the rare person who remains psychologically whole, regardless of the avoidant's proximity, sends an entirely different signal to that nervous system. Their steadiness says, without a single word, your withdrawal does not control my worth, and your presence is welcomed but never required. To an avoidant, this is almost incomprehensible at first because it contradicts every assumption their defenses were built upon. This leads to a second insight rarely spoken aloud in psychological circles, and it concerns the true function of avoidant withdrawal. Withdrawal is not merely an escape from closeness, it is frequently a test, though rarely a conscious one, designed to answer a single unspoken question. Will this person's care survive contact with my imperfection? Most people fail this test without realizing a test was ever administered because they respond to distance with panic, and panic confirms the avoidant's deepest fear, which is that love is conditional upon constant performance. But the person who can tolerate the avoidant's retreat without losing their own center, who can say through their calm presence that imperfection does not revoke belonging, begins to dismantle a belief system that has protected that avoidant person since childhood. This is slow work. It is not romantic in the cinematic sense. It looks from the outside like patience without weakness, warmth without collapse, and boundaries without punishment. Very few people can hold all three simultaneously, which is precisely why so few people ever earn permanent trust from an avoidant heart. Consider now a truth about empaths that is equally uncomfortable because fairness demands it be spoken. Empaths often mistake their own hypervigilance for love, watching a partner's every mood shift, anticipating withdrawal before it happens, adjusting behavior to prevent conflict. This feels like devotion from the inside, but functionally it is often anxiety wearing the costume of care. An empath locked in this pattern is not actually relating to the avoidant person in front of them. They are relating to the possibility of abandonment that the avoidance behavior triggers inside their own nervous system. This is the same wound wearing a different mask, because both people in their own way are reacting to old danger rather than responding to present reality. The tragedy is that two people can love each other honestly and still destroy the relationship, not through malice, but through two separate defense systems firing at exactly the wrong moments, each one convincing the other that danger is real when it may simply be memory. A strange paradox begins to reveal itself once you study enough avoidant relationships closely, and it is this. The avoidant person often chooses partners who unconsciously recreate the very conditions their nervous system once fled. This is not self-sabotage in the simplistic sense people throw around casually. It is something closer to an internal compulsion toward resolution. Human beings are drawn again and again toward emotional situations that resemble their original wound, not because they enjoy suffering, but because some deep part of the mind believes that if the scene can be replayed with a different outcome, the original injury might finally be healed. This explains why an avoidant person can leave one relationship swearing they want ease and simplicity, only to find themselves months later entangled with someone whose emotional intensity mirrors the very parent or caregiver who taught them to withdraw in the first place. They are not chasing chaos. They are chasing completion. Underneath every avoidant defense lies a belief so quiet the person carrying it may never say it aloud, not even to themselves, and the belief is this: if someone truly saw all of me, they would eventually leave. This belief did not arrive through logic. It arrived through repetition, through moments where authenticity was met with disappointment, correction, or emotional retreat from someone who was supposed to offer unconditional safety. So the avoidant adult learns an efficient, if tragic, solution. Show only the parts that are impressive, competent, self-sufficient, and entertaining. Hide the parts that are frightened, needy, uncertain, or soft. This creates the illusion of a person who does not need anyone, when in truth what has actually happened is that the avoidant has simply outsourced the risk of rejection by never allowing full exposure in the first place. You cannot be abandoned for who you truly are if no one is ever permitted to see who you truly are. It is a brilliant defense, and it is also a quiet prison. Here arrives the third insight, the one most attachment content never touches, because it requires abandoning the comfortable villain narrative altogether. Avoidant people frequently possess an unusually intense inner emotional world, not a diminished one. The stereotype suggests that avoidants feel less, that they are simply less capable of depth. The opposite is often closer to the truth. Many avoidants feel with an intensity that once overwhelmed their own capacity to regulate it, and so the nervous system built a dam, not because the water was weak, but because the water was too strong to survive without protection. This is why, occasionally, an avoidant person will surprise everyone around them with a sudden flood of vulnerability, usually late at night, usually unplanned, usually followed by embarrassment and a swift return to distance. That flood is not an anomaly. It is the true self, briefly escaping containment before the old alarm system reasserts control. Now examine what actually creates permanent bonding in an avoidant nervous system, because this is where most explanations fail people. Permanent bonding does not occur through grand romantic gestures. It does not occur through proving loyalty during a single dramatic crisis. It occurs through something far less cinematic and far more powerful, which is the slow accumulation of proof that safety can coexist with honesty. Every time an avoidant person reveals something uncomfortable, whether it is a fear, a failure, an insecurity, or a moment of weakness, and the response they receive is steadiness rather than judgment. A tiny fracture appears in the wall they built as a child. One fracture changes nothing. But fractures, repeated consistently over months and sometimes years, eventually create an opening the avoidant person did not believe was structurally possible. This is why avoidants rarely bond suddenly. Their trust operates on compound interest, not lump sum payments. This brings forward a harsh truth that many partners of avoidance refuse to accept, because accepting it requires humility. You cannot love an avoidant person into healing through sheer intensity of feeling. Intensity, in fact, often produces the opposite effect, because intensity signals to the nervous system that dependency is being requested faster than trust has been earned. Picture two people building a bridge across a canyon. One person insists on constructing the entire bridge in a single day, driven by excitement and urgency. The other person understands that a bridge built too quickly, without testing the foundation at each stage, will collapse under real weight the moment someone attempts to cross it. The avoidant person is, in a sense, the engineer who has already watched one bridge collapse in childhood and now insists, sometimes maddeningly, that every plank be tested before another is placed. This is not cruelty. It is the logic of someone who has learned that falling once is enough to justify permanent caution. Consider now the internal experience of the empath in this same dynamic, because their contribution to the pattern deserves equal honesty rather than sympathy alone. Many empaths unconsciously believe that their own worth is proven through their capacity to endure difficulty on behalf of another person. This belief often traces back to childhood roles where love had to be earned through usefulness, patience, or emotional labor, rather than received simply for existing. So when an avoidant partner withdraws, the empath's psyche interprets the challenge not as a signal to reconsider the relationship, but as an invitation to prove devotion through increased endurance. This is precisely how empaths can remain in relationships that repeatedly wound them, not because they lack self-respect in some general sense, but because their specific definition of self-respect has been quietly hijacked by an old, unexamined belief that suffering equals significance. Breaking this pattern requires the empath to separate two things that feel identical but are not, which is loyalty to another person and loyalty to an old identity built around self-sacrifice. Here is where the deeper philosophical layer of this entire subject emerges, because attachment theory alone cannot fully explain why some bonds become permanent and others dissolve. Every relationship, at its core, is a negotiation between two competing human needs, the need for safety and the need for growth. Safety asks a person to stay within familiar patterns, familiar pain, familiar identities, because familiar pain, however uncomfortable, at least offers predictability. Growth asks a person to risk the unfamiliar, to expand beyond the self they have always known, even though expansion carries no guarantee of a better outcome. The avoidant person, more than most, has organized their entire psychological architecture around the pursuit of safety, often at direct cost to growth. This is why the person who ultimately earns an avoidance permanent bond is rarely the most passionate partner they have ever had. It is almost always the person who somehow made growth feel safer than staying the same. Something else must be said here, something uncomfortable enough that most content creators avoid it entirely. The avoidant person is not the only one capable of using distance as a weapon, even if unintentionally. There exists a lesser discussed pattern where a partner, often an empath, begins with holding warmth strategically, hoping to provoke jealousy, anxiety, or renewed pursuit from the avoidant. This tactic sometimes works in the short term, producing a temporary resurgence of attention, but it fundamentally corrupts the foundation being built, because it teaches the avoidance nervous system that love is once again conditional, unpredictable, and something that must be won through performance rather than received through authenticity. In this way, the very person hoping to heal an avoidance fear of abandonment can accidentally reinforce it, simply by adopting the emotional volatility the avoidant spent their entire life trying to escape. There is a moment, if the relationship survives long enough with enough honesty intact, where something remarkable begins to occur inside the avoidant person, and it deserves to be named precisely. It is the moment when vulnerability stops feeling like danger and starts feeling like relief. This shift does not happen through a single conversation, no matter how profound. It happens through what might be called emotional habituation. The same mechanism by which a person afraid of cold water eventually stops flinching once their body adjusts to the temperature. The nervous system, given enough repeated evidence that honesty does not lead to abandonment, slowly recalibrates its baseline definition of safety. This is not a metaphor invented for inspiration. It is closer to a description of how the human brain actually works, forming new associative pathways through repetition until the old alarm system quiets, not because it was defeated in argument, but because it simply stopped receiving the evidence it once relied upon to justify its vigilance. What most people never realize is that the avoidant nervous system does not measure trust in words at all. It measures trust in behavior repeated under pressure. A person can say, "I will never leave you 1,000 times," and none of those 1,000 declarations will register as deeply as one single moment where the avoidant person exposed something shameful and the other person did not flinch. Language, to a wounded nervous system, is cheap currency, because language costs nothing to produce and nothing to break. Behavior under pressure is expensive currency, because it can only be paid when the stakes are real. This is why avoidants often distrust excessive verbal reassurance, sometimes even resent it, while quietly cataloging every small moment where a partner's actions match their words during an actual test. The person who wants to earn permanent bonding from an avoidant must understand that they are not being evaluated on their promises. They are being evaluated on their consistency during the exact moments when consistency is inconvenient. Something must be said now about identity, because identity sits underneath every pattern already described. The avoidant person often does not know who they are outside of their independence, because independence became the entire architecture of their selfhood at a very young age. Ask an avoidant to describe themselves, and they will often list competencies, achievements, and self-sufficiency before they ever mention emotional needs, relationships, or desires. This is not vanity. It is the natural result of building an identity around the one thing that never abandoned them, which is their own capability. To then ask this person to depend on someone else is to ask them to partially dissolve the very identity that kept them alive during their most unstable years. No wonder the process feels less like falling in love and more like slow, controlled demolition of a building they personally engineered brick by brick. Here is a fourth insight, rarely spoken plainly, and it concerns what actually happens the moment an avoidant person finally does bond permanently. Contrary to popular belief, this bonding does not feel like relief at first. It often feels like fear intensifying rather than fear disappearing, because for the first time the avoidant person has something significant to lose. Before permanent bonding occurs, an avoidance detachment offered a strange form of safety, since nothing deeply valued meant nothing catastrophic could be taken. Once genuine attachment forms, that protective numbness disappears, and in its place arrives a raw, unfamiliar vulnerability that can feel almost unbearable initially. This explains a confusing phenomenon partners often report, where the relationship seems to be going beautifully, trust seems to be deepening, and then suddenly the avoidant person pulls away harder than ever before. This is not regression. It is often the exact opposite. It is the nervous system reacting to the terrifying realization that it has, for the first time in years, allowed something to matter. Consider a story, not of two lovers, but of two strangers on opposite sides of a locked door, because this image captures something language alone struggles to convey. One person stands outside the door, knocking gently, sometimes urgently, believing that enough persistence will eventually cause the door to open. The other person stands inside, hand resting near the lock, terrified not of the person knocking, but of what happens to their own carefully constructed safety the moment that door swings open. The tragedy of most relationships involving an avoidant partner is that the person outside interprets the locked door as rejection of them personally, when in truth the door has remained locked against every person who has ever approached it, long before this particular relationship began. The door is not commentary on worth. The door is a scar wearing the shape of architecture. A deeper contradiction now deserves attention, because avoidant psychology is filled with contradictions that most explanations flatten into oversimplified categories. Avoidant people frequently crave depth even while fleeing the intimacy required to reach it. This sounds impossible until you understand that craving and capacity are two entirely different systems within the human psyche. A person can genuinely long for profound connection while simultaneously lacking the internal safety mechanisms required to tolerate that connection once it arrives. This is similar to someone who desperately wants to run a marathon but has never trained their body to withstand the physical demand of 26 miles. The desire is authentic. The capacity has simply not yet been built. Avoidant people are not liars when they express longing for closeness, even if their behavior seems to contradict that longing moments later. They are more often individuals whose desire has outpaced their nervous system's current tolerance for the thing they desire. This raises an uncomfortable question that deserves a direct answer rather than avoidance. Can an avoidant person actually change, or are partners simply wasting years hoping for a transformation that will never arrive? The honest answer is more nuanced than either extreme allows. Avoidant patterns are not fixed personality traits carved permanently into a person's identity. They are learned adaptive strategies, and anything learned can, in principle, be unlearned, though not through willpower alone and rarely through a partner's effort alone either. Genuine change in an avoidant person typically requires their own conscious recognition of the pattern, combined with a relational environment safe enough to practice new behavior repeatedly without catastrophic consequence. A partner cannot force this internal work to happen. A partner can only create the external conditions under which that internal work becomes possible, which is an important distinction because it removes the false belief that love alone possesses the power to heal another person's childhood wound. Something equally important must be said about the empath's own necessary evolution within this dynamic, because healing is never a one-directional obligation. The empath who wishes to build a lasting bond with an avoidant partner must eventually confront their own tendency to derive identity from being needed. This is uncomfortable work because it requires the empath to sit with moments of silence, distance, or emotional unavailability without immediately trying to fix, soothe, or rescue the situation. Paradoxically, this restraint often accomplishes more than any amount of active reassurance ever could because it demonstrates something the avoidant nervous system has rarely witnessed, which is a person capable of remaining emotionally regulated without requiring the avoidant to perform reassurance in return. In this way, both people are quietly asked to release the exact defense mechanism that once felt like protection, the avoidant releasing distance as identity, the empath releasing rescue as worth. There exists a lesser-known psychological phenomenon worth naming directly, sometimes called earned security, and it describes something remarkable about human resilience. Earned security refers to individuals who did not begin life with secure attachment, who experienced genuine wounds in childhood, yet who, through significant relationships, self-awareness, or deliberate psychological work, developed attachment patterns indistinguishable from those raised in genuinely secure environments. This matters enormously here because it proves that avoidant attachment is not a permanent life sentence. It also reveals something crucial about the role certain partners play in this transformation, not as saviors who fix a broken person, but as consistent presences whose steadiness becomes internalized over time as evidence that the world operates differently than the avoidant person once believed. The partner does not heal the avoidant. The partner provides the conditions under which the avoidant becomes capable of healing themselves. One final layer deserves careful attention before this exploration reaches its conclusion, because it reframes everything discussed so far into a single unifying principle. The person an avoidant bonds to permanently is never simply the most patient person, nor the most loving, nor even the most understanding. It is the person who, throughout every test, every withdrawal, every moment of confusing distance, never once abandoned their own sense of self in the process. Self-abandonment disguised as devotion is the single most common reason permanent bonds fail to form, because an avoidant person, consciously or not, is constantly searching for evidence that closeness requires someone else to disappear. The moment they encounter a partner who remains fully, unmistakably themselves regardless of the avoidant's emotional weather, something shifts permanently. Not because that partner performed love more skillfully than others, but because that partner proved, through undeniable behavior, that love and self-erasure are not, in fact, the same thing.